When it comes to intergenerational communication, one person really stands out as an example of great practice, and she has shaped how I personally speak and host. That's Rachel Turner. Many people discover Rachel through her books and the organisation she founded, Parenting for Faith. Rachel has worked for over 15 years as a family life pastor, children's pastor and youth pastor, and served on church senior leadership teams. She continues to consult, speak at conferences and run training days for church leaders, parents and families around the world. Rachel Turner is currently the discipleship lead at Hope Church Harrogate. She's the author of 10 books for families, parents and church leaders, including It Takes a Church to Raise a Parent and her new release, Parenting Teens for a Life of Faith. I'm Melanie Cave, Managing Director at Roots for Churches, and I know you'll enjoy this wide-ranging interview where Rachel and I talk about developing skills for intergenerational communication. Hello, Rachel. Welcome to the Roots for Churches podcast. I'm so excited to have you here. Yay!
Me too!
I've been looking forward to this. So we're going to talk about intergenerational communication skills, but I want to caveat that by saying that these skills work in an intergenerational setting, but they're actually just good practice.
What I like about intergenerational is it sort of holds you to account for good communication skills. So it's not that intergenerational needs very specific and niche skills. It's just when you have everybody in the room together, then you know that you need to communicate well. And I think that's what I really like about it, is because I think I can probably get very lazy in my communication, and having lots of diverse people in a room means I actually need to bring some skills to it. And when you do, it's really releasing. And so for me, I think sometimes we see communication skills as a sort of like eye roll thing. But for me, it's the essentialness of how can we facilitate the most amount of people getting to meet with God and getting to meet with each other well. It's the difference between disconnection and connection for me. And I think therefore it's a really key thing for us to talk about.
I think some people don't think they're skills. I think people think, oh, they're just naturally a good communicator, or they're just they naturally connect with all ages. That person's just brilliant. And the way they talk, the way they use an object lesson or whatever, it just works. But I can't do that because I'm not wired that way. And I think people don't see it as a skill, possibly because it doesn't get taught in like a theological college. If you go to Vicar Factory, if you are studying to be a minister, there's rarely a session on good intergenerational communication skills. There may not even be one on communication skills. There might be something on how to do theology but yeah, I wonder. I mean, I know you do a course that does talk about intergenerational communication, but I'm sure that's actually come about because it's not out there.
Yes. My laziness means I only do things that there's a hole for. And I think for me, I want to say it because I think people discount themselves from it, and people see it as the gift. Oh, they're just natural communicators or something. And I think who they look at has actually spent years refining their skills. And so it looks natural to them, but that's because they've purchased it through the blood, sweat, and tears of doing it badly for a really long time and seeing the fruit of when you do it well. And so those of us who have been in it for a while have learned through a lot of mistakes how to do it well. And I do think it's a skill that everybody can learn. And so therefore, it always grieves me when I see, particularly in intergenerational spaces, only the children's people or only the teachers or anyone who has experience with kids being pulled forward. Because one, I think we prioritize only people who can communicate to kids. And actually the skill is not, can you communicate to children? The skill is, how can I hold a diverse group of people together in one space and help them navigate well? And that is a skill that everyone can learn.
So do you think we have some misconceptions about how we have to communicate with children? That means that we do it in like a really narrow, sort of banded way, and that's why we get the teachers or the children's leader up, when in fact some of the good ways of communication work across the board?
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's a confusion about what helps children engage. And so I think we look at entertainment to see that. So you sort of look at entertainment for, it's got to be fast, it's got to be entertaining, it's got to be interesting. And so we look at adults and kids and think, oh, they're vastly different from each other. But I would suggest that when you look at children, the teachers that they love are not necessarily the fun, crazy ones. They're the calm, clear, consistent ones, which actually many church leaders are naturally. And so I think we have created fantasy of what children need and then try to give it to them in a way that disconnects adults, when actually there's a really much communication that holds everyone together. I think we're much similar than we think we are. And the more we try to treat everyone as vastly different and needing different things, the more we're going to feel the need to disconnect. And the whole point of Intergen is to bring people together. And there is one way of doing that.
So this is relevant. This kind of communication is relevant if you are a preacher who preaches in a congregation that doesn't have any children at all.
Yes. Because Intergen is not just about kids. It's about helping everybody in that space meet with each other, which means 30-year-olds and 70-year-olds. I just want to say, sorry, yeah. I got a little high hope.
And it works, if you're in the toddler group, you're not on a Sunday morning, you're in a toddler group, you've got grandparents, parents, childminders, under fives. You're missing that sort of middle section, but that's still intergenerational. And I think sometimes in a toddler group, people can either talk to the under fives or the under threes, or they just talk to the parents. And there is a way where you can talk to both and can engage. It feels difficult though, because I think in our minds we go, well, I have to talk slow, or I have to use very small words, or I have to limit what I'm trying to say. And I suppose that kind of comes back to your original thing of you got to do your prep work. You've got to actually not be lazy and just waffle off the cuff and say, oh, it'll be fine. Because you've lost maybe the very elderly and the very young attention span or word choice. They've lost what you're saying.
Yeah.
So how do you go about preparing to communicate? Like what is your process to communicate if you're maybe in an intergenerational setting that might be different to, say, you're just rocking up with a bunch of people your age?
Okay, so this may be controversial, but I don't prep any differently for intergenerational or people just my age, because it's all good communication.
Yeah.
But I'm really clear about what my values are for that space. And so I deliberately will look at the program, whether I'm doing a toddler group or anything, and I will ask myself key questions, because honestly, I guess, pick a person that represents sort of what I need. And so for me, I'm always trying to talk to the 30-year-old new to faith dyslexic is my center, because that means it's a person who's new to the faith space and therefore won't instinctively know what church requires, won't know all the language, will feel slightly uncomfortable with the different generations and will need help forming relationships, and won't be super comfortable with reading and talking at the front. And so for me, I'm like, okay, how do I help that person who needs facilitation and good communication navigate through whatever I'm doing? And I sort of ask myself questions about how do I explain what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and I tell them how to engage. And so that's my prep work. I'll look at it and I'll go, okay, we're going to lead into, if you're looking at a toddler group, we're going to lead into a singing time. So how do I explain it that says, this is what we're doing, this is what I'm going to do, this is why we're doing it, because we love to tell God how happy we are to be with him and how exciting it is. And how you can engage is I want everyone to come forward, your big bodies, the small bodies, and we are going to sit here right on the floor, and we're going to think of one thing that we want to tell God about our day, and we're going to say it. That's how I would explain it, whether I have kids in the room, not kids in the room. That's what I would explain to people, because that's what they need. They need to know what I'm going to do. They need to know why we're going to do it, and they need to know how they can engage with it. And so I will prep by looking and thinking, what do I need to explain? What's a new thing that I've never explained before that I need to? I got really stumbly on the whole giving to church thing when I'm hosting a service. It's like, how do I explain why we want your money? How do I explain it in a way that's actually what I actually mean? Or how do I explain why we read the Bible up front when everyone can just read it on their phone? Like, how do I help people go through this? And so my prep work is, how do I make people feel safe in this experience?
And I think we think of communication and we think church, and we think, okay, that's the sermon, or okay, that's the teaching bit. But there's a lot of church or leading any group that is kind of the comparing, the emceeing, the hosting role, which is helping people navigate. And in some churches, that will be the same person who does everything. And in some churches, that will be a pair of people who get up and sort of lead through the service. In your toddler group, it might be a different person does each section. But it's a really vital role that I think we underestimate. And it can be a slightly different skill set to preaching. That
Yes.
hosting and communicating, as you say, it's helping people navigate. And I think for those of us who've been around church for a while, it's intuitive why we're doing what we're doing. It's intuitive what comes next. But as you say, it's not for the very young, the very old, the new, somebody visiting.
Or
But does
people
it
who've
not?
been in church for a long time who have never had that explained to them. So sometimes I have people who've been Christians for 30 years who will go, I never knew that's why we did that, because they've never had that framed for them. They've never had that explained for them and told how to engage. And so I think even if you've been around it for a while, we haven't necessarily explained well how to do it.
And how does you keep it from feeling like you're just explaining everything? So I know in Roots, we often have this in the magazine, there'll be like an activity. And we used to have a lot of rubric, which is basically that tiny bit of text that says, this is why you're doing this, or this is how you should do. And we thought, well, people don't read that. Like, you're always talking about it and explaining. How do we keep our church from becoming so chatty? Do you know, like, that we're always, it's like you have a little, I don't know, audio guide when you go through a museum, and this over here is for this. And it's like, well, I just want to look at the painting, stop talking to me about it. But also sometimes that audio guide helps.
Yeah.
But how do we keep that balance so that we're not over explaining? I had a chat with a minister the other day, and he was saying there's a bit of mystery in faith. There's a mystery in rituals and symbolism. And if you explain them all, you lose the magic, you lose the mystery, you lose the point of symbolism is that you can't explain all of it. And I was like, yeah, but I still want to know why we're putting ashes on our foreheads.
Well, yeah.
It's weird.
It is weird.
Tell me more.
But also, it's a mystery. But I think it's the difference between trying to explain everything away and setting people up well to experience it. And those are two different things. And so, for instance, the ashes on the head thing, there's I'm just going to explain it away and tell you exactly, how to navigate this activity. But what we're trying to communicate is how to engage with this activity, which is a different thing. And so, to me, that's the difference. If I'm just explaining everything, then I'm just giving people a list of things to do. What I'm trying to say is, this is why we're doing it. And so how you engage with it is take some time to think about these things and think about that symbolism in your life and what you might mean, and chat to God about it. So it's like I'm hand-holding people to the experience and letting them have the experience themselves. But if they don't know what they're doing or why, then they can't engage in the mystery because they're busy trying to figure out if they're doing something right. I'm trying to remove hindrances with my communication rather than control their behavior.
Okay, so I think one of the things that's coming out is this idea of like people need permission, or people are worried about getting it wrong, or people don't know quite what to expect. And so they hold themselves back.
Yeah.
And would you say that's true of adults and children, or are children more likely, or is that just a personality thing? Like, do some people just dive in, or are most people quite hesitant?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for all of humanity. In my experience of leading, I find that people are quite hesitant, not necessarily because of fear, but some people are hesitant because of comfortability. And so if you want to motivate them to do something they're not used to, they need a reason why. I think some people are hesitant because they don't quite know what to do. And so they'll give you their behavior, but they won't necessarily engage their hearts, which is why they need that clarity. And so for me, that communication is so important because it enables people to take the next steps in it, not because they're necessarily one or the other afraid or hesitant. It's that I want to make sure there's nothing stopping them from stepping forward. And so for me, that's why I don't want to do huge paragraphs on everything, but I need to make sure I'm giving the 1 or 2 sentences that enable people to say, this is what we're going to do because we feel that this is important. God does this, you do this, and so set your hearts ready to do that. Just is a sentence that always enables that it's greased, that it's smooth. And I think that is the key thing, that I don't want anything to stand in the way of people engaging. And often it's communication that stops them from engaging because they don't know how.
So I love that thing of like, that you are not explaining away the experience, but you are guiding them up to the experience and then releasing them with a few tools or a few pathways, how they might experience it. And is there then sort of like a landing back or coming back together, or like, I don't know, we've just sung this song, or we've just lit this candle, or we've just had ashes put on our forehead. Wow. Like people have had all these experiences. Do we need to then kind of create a space to reflect or reframe, or turn to the person next to you and tell them what happened? I don't know. I just feel like you lead them to this moment and then what?
That's the key of the thing. So that's, for me, why we have to navigate the whole experience. Our job is to help them navigate the whole experience with clarity, because our job is to explain what they're engaging in, enable them to engage, help them land that well, and know what to do with that experience next. And so we say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to say we're setting up reading the Bible. Let's go for something really simple. We're going to now read the Bible. Sometimes you just say, now we're going to do our Bible reading, but that means we haven't actually navigated them with clarity. So if we say, when we read the Bible, God's words go out and we get to receive that. And sometimes God pokes our hearts, and sometimes it just encourages our spirit. And so as we read the Bible, listen to God's words and be open to what he might want to do in you as those words go into your ears and into your hearts. I've never said it that way before, but let's say that's a way of framing it. I'd probably then sit down and go, did I like that? Do I not like that? But that's, what. And then we do it. And then say, at the end of that, I so appreciate those truths going in. And this is where you can find it in the Bible. Feel free to read more of it if you want to do that. But for now, we're going to listen to somebody talk about that bit of the Bible and expand that more for us. But also know that you and God get to expand this more for you. And then we move on. And so that we're sort of giving them next steps as we go, to help them navigate what we're about to do, what we just did, how to go deeper into that. And it gives them permission. I think I'm really keen always on giving people permission for what to do, because if they don't have permission, then they feel restricted. And so I'm always saying, feel free to listen or not listen, or here's different ways of engaging in this activity. There's going to be a sermon. Feel free to take notes. Feel free to listen. Feel free to let your brain spiral off on something that you read. This is a time for you and God to respond to the word. And that's really helpful, because otherwise people are like, there's a sermon. And I've had so many people apologize to me because they'll say, you said something 3 minutes in and my brain just went in a spiral. And I was just thinking about this whole thing about theology and I didn't even listen to what you said. And they apologized to me. And I'm like, that's exactly what I want you to do. This is to provoke you to spend time thinking about God together. And if that means you take a 20-minute spiral because something I said provoked you to choose something with God, that's beautiful to me. And they need the permission to know that that's okay. And so I want to create all the different ways of engaging. If I have people turn to each other and say something, I always give them permission to not engage, because I will have people for whom that is terrifying. And so if I say, turn to each other and share one thing, or feel free to say, I'm just here to listen. And then they know they have a phrase, and I will watch people say those things, because then they are empowered to listen rather than feel like they need to share. My job is to give them all the permission to feel safe and navigate them safely.
I think we get really uncomfortable with that level of choice and that level of options. I don't know if it comes from the way many of us were at school, like, this is what we're all doing now, join in, or else you'll be in trouble. Or maybe there's just a high, we need control. But the idea that, like, as the spiritual leader, as the preacher, as the worship leader, I need to guide you on this pathway that I feel like God has maybe shown me, that this is where we want to go as a community today. This is the pathway, whether it's liturgy or some worship, or we're going to pray about this. I have a sense from God, or the pattern that I'm following, that this is where we need to go. And I want you all to come with me as much as possible. And if I say to them, well, during the sermon, you can think about anything you want. If it really helps you, you draw a picture. Get up and wander around the room if it helps you to concentrate. We worry, one, that they won't be listening to us and that all our prep will be in vain. Two, that they're doing their own thing will distract other people. Or three, that kind of like, maybe God's not quite big enough to meet them and he has to do it through me in this one specific way. And I think we just get quite uptight of like, I want to do a really good job of leading, and that means we're all going this way, charge, and the idea that we might sort of release a bunch of cats in the sanctuary and they'll wander around and eventually they'll all find the food bowl, but they might not all make their way there. That scares us. And I have to often remind myself, these are God's sheep. They're in his pasture. It's his church. He leads them. Yes, he does speak through me and to me and give me a sense of direction. But I don't know that many people feel loved and led when I'm cracking the whip, like sort of cattle ride. Everybody must come this way now, and well, some people respond to that kind of leadership and want really to lead, to be led like that. But I think most people like to get there of their own volition a bit more.
Yeah.
But as you say, with some coaching, with some guide rails, with some, here's where you want to go and here's why. And they're like, oh yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
rather than there is no other option, my way or the highway.
Yeah, because I want them to genuinely feel seen and loved. Like you said, loved and led. I want them to feel loved and led. I don't want them to feel controlled and manipulated. And I think it's really important that we give permission to be themselves and to be unashamed of that, because we've got loads of people who can't, well, who can force their bodies to sit still for 25 minutes. But if I say, the way I tend to frame it is we know that everyone's different. And so my ask is that you engage in the way that you engage best. And if that means you need to stand up and walk around, feel free. We got loads of space at the back. And if you need to fiddle with something in your hands, that's absolutely fine. If you need to draw or do things, we've got some stuff for you to do that. My goal is for you to engage. My goal is not for you to have to control your body for 25 minutes. And so you do what you need to do to engage. And that means that I'm not saying do whatever you want. I'm saying this is a time for you and God to chew together. You do how you need to do that, because I'm here for you. You're not here for me. And that's, to me, important, that people feel that permission to be themselves. Because otherwise, I watch parents desperately trying to control their children to do the behavior instead of actually helping their kids engage. The last thing I want them to do is to be focused on obeying. I want them to be focused on engaging.
That's good. Because I think screens in church, for example, some people come and they bring a child and the child is on a tablet playing a game, or plenty of adults, pop out a game and play some sort of like,
yes,
hopefully mindless, but, so that they're listening, but not always.
Yes.
And you can look over in your very self-righteous way and be like, they've got a screen out in church.
Yeah.
What a bad Christian, or what a bad parent, or what a bad adult who can't concentrate. And my youngest regularly replies to me things like, this is helping me listen. I'm like, is it really? But,
Yeah.
sometimes it is. Sometimes
Yes.
the little mindless screen thing means that I stop fidgeting.
Yes.
And I can engage my brain.
Yes.
Sometimes the person is making their shopping list, but
Yes.
by putting something on the shopping list, they're now able to concentrate on what you're saying. Sometimes the person is gone into their online banking and is giving to the church. Sometimes the person is taking notes. Sometimes they're reading the Bible.
Yeah.
We can't always see what's going on their screen. But you're right. So it's quite possible that they are distracted, but we don't know what day they've had either. And maybe being in God's presence without judgment would be a good thing for them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just, I think it's hard. If you've been brought up around certain church cultures of like, this is how we behave, this is what we do, to permission alternatives feels risky, countercultural, possibly disrespectful. Like, this is a holy space, we're supposed to sit like this, dress like this, act like this, not run around, etc. We have to unlearn, don't we? And to be more inclusive and to allow people to actually engage rather than just look like they're engaging.
Yes. And that's from what their bodies do to what their hearts are doing. I'll give permission for people to feel things, because, we're hitting this big topic. And I'm like, for some of you, this may be making you angry. And that's okay if that's making you feel this, or if it makes you go, oh, but what if? And that's a good thing. Why don't you, if you came with someone, I tend to not speak to kids. I tend to say, if you came with someone that's part of your family, you could turn and say, what if this? Because we want to talk about that later. And that's okay to do that too. And so it's almost giving them permission to feel the things they're feeling, or to engage in the way they want to do. That sense of highlighting to them all the different ways of engaging means I find they engage more rather than less.
Amazing. So let's talk. In your article, you said something about creating an authentic and warm tone when you are speaking. And I think we're both smiling because we both experienced tones that are maybe less authentic.
Yes.
My pet peeve is the sing-song voice when people get up in front of a mixed group.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Melanie. Could you give me an example of that, please?
You're almost doing it now, but
hi,
kids!
Hi, everybody!
It becomes this, like, I don't know, these children's telly presenter on steroids, or like somebody who's had way too much coffee. And you're just a bit like...
Yes.
Most of the room is kind of internally cringing.
Yes.
There might be a 2-year-old who suddenly looks up, because the voice is a little bit more interesting.
Yes.
But then they quickly switch off because it's weird.
Yes.
And most everybody else in the room is like, why are they doing that?
Yes.
And that's not how anybody talks to me, so it's obviously not for me. So
Yes.
that over egging the energy to try to
Yes.
get young attention to kind of
Yes.
look at you, maybe it works for 5 seconds, but I think it backfires more than it helps.
Completely agree. You will never
So
be
what's the
interesting
right
enough.
one?
You will
Yeah.
never be interesting enough from the front to keep you will that is a mountain that will never end, because then they'll get used to your amped voice and then it's gonna be like this, and then you have to go even higher, and it's so inauthentic. And for me, it proactively, there's a danger to it. If I want to get really that, I think there's a danger to it, because it seems so inauthentic that it switches into performance, which then communicates a whole different thing about Christianity. It then becomes entertainment. And then it also means that you lose your integrity as a leader, because that is not the voice you use when you're talking to them after church. And so therefore, then you are a different person when you're up front. And so much of that, it's not just, it doesn't necessarily work, but it also, I think, disconnects people from you and causes people to disengage. So the tone that I think is works is authentic and warm, because I think what people are reacting against is performance. That's what people are reacting against. And they often are reacting against, authority is not the right word. I'm in charge, and so therefore you will do what I say.
Head teacher
that
voice.
in chargeness. What people want is to be shepherded, and to be shepherded by an authentic person who has real stories about their life, who makes mistakes, and who is there to keep them safe. That's what they love. And so for me, that's why I do like that. I think it's not, I don't know if it's a good analogy or not, but if you think about the teachers that you loved, they often weren't the most hyped and engaging, but they were the safest. They were the ones who were clear, and they were the ones who were steady, and they were the ones who told you a little bit of a thing and you couldn't believe that you knew that about them in their real life. And they were genuine. They were genuine, and you genuinely knew you were loved. And I think for me, I want a congregation to genuinely feel seen and loved and safe with me. And so the tone, which is what everyone can do, everyone can be authentic and warm. And so rather than feeling like, how can I perform this well so that people feel like they are getting good quality leadership, my question is, how am I making people feel seen, loved by a real person who also loves Jesus? And so that authentic, warm tone is absolutely crucial. It should be the same voice you have off or on. And so often that means if you're new to that and you get nervous leading from the front, you've got to think about, if you had a room full of your friends, how would you welcome everybody and navigate them? It would be you, just with a bit more structure. And that's what to me it is.
So I've heard you say that you're an introvert, which might surprise people because you're so bubbly and
yeah.
exciting to listen to. But how do you, I guess I'm thinking like an extrovert kind of gets up in front of a group and does, well, some of us still tremble a little bit or have, but that idea of like, you can kind of talk to a crowd and it's okay, but are there skills of how do you do warm? I think sometimes when you talk to a crowd, it becomes impersonal. And the more you structure something, the less authentic it can feel, because immediately as soon as you give just instructions to a room of 40, 100, even larger, it feels impersonal. And I would say of the tricks of the trade, but are there ways to shortcut towards that sense of authenticity, or for an introvert to not like, oh my gosh, there's so many people looking at me, because I think sometimes we get children's leaders who get asked to do stuff in gathered church and they're like, I'm great with kids, but put me in front of a whole room full of people and they're all staring at me, and the adults don't smile when they look at you. They give you their listening face, which is usually a scowl, and it just feels threatening. And how do you come across as warm and loving and not saccharine? Because I think sometimes we try to turn the volume up a bit too much.
Nice.
And then it goes into that inauthentic. So practice is probably the answer, but how do you get that right bit on the dial?
Okay, so no one's ever asked me this question before, and I think it's an excellent question. So you're literally going to get what drops out of my head right now. For me, there's a couple of things. For introverts, or if you're just nervous of the room, I find it really helpful that game is in my head. And so the game that I have to play in my head is that I've got to stop thinking about it being about them liking me. I am here as a servant, and there are people here who need to feel safe. And it's kind of like when you see a lost kid, you don't go, I hope that kid likes me. You just go up and go, are you okay? Because you know right now, this isn't about you. This is about helping that kid feel safe. You are responding to that kid. And so I remind myself before I get up, in this room are people who maybe have never been to church before. In this room are people who've invited their friends, and they're really hoping that I help them navigate it safely. In this room are kids who need to know that who they are and what happens to their bodies is welcome and loved. In this room are older people who need me to talk slowly because they love being part of it and need to be able to hear. And so I sit there, and often what I do is I just sit on the side and I look around the room at the people that God has called me to love and serve right now. And so I get up with a heart of compassion and service rather than, right, I'm going to lead this thing and do this well. And so for me, I want that mom who looks like she hasn't slept with a baby to know how to meet with Jesus today. And I want the new person who still isn't sure that God is here and wants to know that they have an escape plan, knows where the toilets are, so that they're not sitting there thinking, I need to go. And so my job is to make them feel safe, because it's really not about me. But the other way that I keep it warm is I actually look at people in the faces, because it's really easy to talk to the room. And when you talk to the room, you're presenting and performing. When I'm looking at individual faces, then I am talking to people. And so when I say, just so you know, if you need to know where the toilets are and the baby change, and I'll find a family who needs a baby change, and just be like, it's right there, turn the corner. And sometimes what I'll find are people who are Christians or people who've been in that church for a while. I say the baby change is around the corner, and then I'll look at them and say, is it the second or the third? It's the third door. And then they can confirm to me, which means that then I have pulled them in, because I'm confirming with the body in the room that those instructions are right. And so whether it's new people or old people, I find faces in which I find that they then smile at me, because they then feel connected, and I then feel like I'm serving the people I love and the people that God has given me, rather than trying to present to a room that is loads.
And in some of our smaller churches, that's even easier, isn't it? I used to find preaching that there was one person who would sit and she would grin at me and nod the whole way. And you just preach to the one person, don't you? When they're smiling
Yes.
at you, you're like,
yes,
you're loving this, I'll preach to you.
yes,
And,
yes.
And I think there is that of like, it isn't to a screen, it isn't a performance, it is something that happens in community. And so that connecting in community is so key, isn't it? Yeah. Can you talk to me a little bit about, we've kind of touched on this throughout this conversation, about how you facilitate connection with God, and how you frame that. Obviously, we can't control God, and people are all really different. How do we lead people towards that connection with God well without controlling the outcomes?
Yes. For me, I often need to give them, okay, so there's the safety of the activity, and then there's the helping them navigate what to do within that. So like I always say, what I'm going to do, what I'm going to ask them to do, and what God is going to do based on we know from the Bible. Because often we leave out the God bit. And so we're like, I'm going to ask you to do this, and then we'll see what happens. And that's
feels spooky,
scary,
doesn't it? Yeah.
For people who are new. You know, we're going to tell God this terrifying thing about our lives. Good luck. And so for me, sometimes it's helpful to frame God loves connecting with us about our stuff. And he never meets us with anger or judgment, because the moment of this moment is we come to him and he loves us and he frees us and he wants to take it off of us. That was the whole purpose of Jesus. And so in this moment, I'm going to ask you to talk to God about whatever's on your heart. And you could tell your story to him. You can tell him what you're afraid of. You could show him the things that you've been hiding from him. But know that there is a God who loves you, who is ready to respond. And you can have as big or as little conversation as you want. He's not going to take away your choice in this. He will meet you to the extent that you want to open it up to him. And so if you want to show him a little thing, he'll talk to you about that. If you want to show him a big thing, he'll talk to you about that. This is a moment that you get to sit with God and do that. And then I'm going to give us about 6 minutes. I usually from the front, I've learned this from my beautiful autistic people. I set a timer. I'm going to check back with Innes in about 6 minutes, and I will put a timer on my phone from the front, because it makes people feel safe that they're not going to be left there for 40 minutes. And then I check back with him, and I will say, you know, that's now you can do more of that, or we're going to move on to this or something. And it gives them a space so that they know They know what to do. They know what to say. They know what God's going to do, and they know what I'm going to do, so that we're not left in these spaces. So from little silly things like, hey, everybody, welcome to each other. God loves hearing about our stuff too. So why don't you tell God one thing that you just found awful about this week while we're sitting around? You can just chat to God in your head or whatever. I constantly am giving them opportunities and to try that with them knowing how it's going to be met. Yes.
I love that. I think it builds expectation as well. Like, it's like, we know that God loves us and we know that God wants to meet with us, but when you say it out loud and then ask people to pray, you've created this environment where God so wants to meet with us, but people have switched on their expectation.
Yes.
And then I feel like that is faith. Faith is kind of another way of thinking about, like, what are we hoping for? What are we expecting? What are we open to? What are we believing can happen? And it creates that culture of faith with our permissioning, with our prayerful expectation, and then people do meet with God and have more significant encounters. What would you say to somebody who feels like, oh gosh, are you not kind of scripting what God has to do? Are you not kind of making everybody be a bit like you, or like encounter God like you? How do we do it in a way that permissions but doesn't overly control?
Yeah. So I think there are two different things. So sometimes you're doing a sermon and you're headed for a point. Do you know what I mean? You're like, this is the main thing. God can weave all things together for the good of those who loves the Lord. And so you are saying, for those of you who are experiencing this, tell God how you feel. For those of you who need help, tell him I need help. I think it's okay to give a next step for those things. But I think my question is, where is the space for the other bits? Because I want them to have permission for those other bits. There's two things. One, I think I like raising rebellious congregation. My congregation knows that they can do whatever they want. They can chat to Jesus about whatever they want to chat to Jesus in this moment. So I think there's one thing that I've created a culture of permission. That means that they feel like that. There are also times where I think that I should not be directive in that. And so there was one, what was I preaching on? I was preaching on, that sometimes our grief and our worry makes us only see what's right in front of us, and we lose the perspective of God. And so I was walking around with a big sheet over my head, and how you bump into everything because you can only deal with what you can see. And actually the whole point is that what the obstacle were in front of us may not go away, but when we worship, we lift our eyes and we see the wider perspective than just the obstacle. And I felt like I could have led into very directive things there. But I said, sometimes we just need time with God to talk about this stuff. And so whether you want to talk about the obstacle, whether you want to worship, whether you have questions that you want to ask him, I just want to give you time with God. And so I'm going to give you 10, 15 minutes where the music is just going to be playing and no one's going to be singing words and no one's going to be talking out loud from the front. And you just got 10 minutes. You can sit and be bored. You can sit and talk to him. You can just sit and enjoy being with him, or just enjoy 10 minutes of peace. But I think there's something that means that it's your chance to spend time with God. And I just safeguard that space, because sometimes people need help knowing how to talk to God about the big stuff. And sometimes they just need space. And it doesn't have to be the same every time.
So I want to ask a question from an intergenerational perspective. Like, if you have under fives, or if I'm sitting with my family and you gave 10 to 15 minutes of space to meet with God, as a parent, I might be like, is my responsibility here to help my child stay focused? Is my responsibility here to stop my child hitting their siblings so that everybody can focus? Is my responsibility here to ignore everybody? Mm-hmm. What do I do if my small person just wanders around the room? In that setting, like, I think it's great to give all the options, but I think maybe you probably would have framed this when you did it, but like,
yes,
where's my parental responsibility, or where's my responsibility to those I'm with in this time of silence that could be just for me?
Yes. And so sometimes part of that is creating the culture within the church to know how to ask for help. Because sometimes parents will really need that 10 minutes with Jesus. And so what I will frame in a space like that, where if we just have 10 minutes to go and say, this is your time with Jesus, I will say you can do whatever you want, but I'll also say feel free to lay on the ground if you want to do that. Feel free to flip through a Bible and look at that if you're not sure. And if you have small people with you and you would like to connect with God, feel free to turn to neighbors around you and ask if they wouldn't mind coming alongside your kids so that you might be able to have time too, if that would be helpful to you. And so sometimes I have people on standby for that. So at one church I had a whole bunch of teenagers who love being family buddies, and they were just like, call me in at any moment. And so I would just say, raise your hand if you need a buddy to help facilitate your family in this situation. And someone would swoop in and take the baby or go walk someone else that. And sometimes it just is, I drop the parent hint, I call it, which is not to say, parents, you need to do this, because as soon as I direct parents to do something, they are then under parenting pressure to deliver that. And I find that is unreasonable expectation on parents. If I say, parents, why don't you talk to your kids and help them do this? Then they feel like everyone's watching them to see whether or not they were able to do what I told them to do. So when I say you got 10 minutes, you can lay on the floor, you can write down stuff, you can spend some time on your own. What I hope and look in the room to see is if adults then feel the need to turn to their kids and reiterate those conversations. Do you want to lay on the ground? Do you want to write? Do you want to do those things? But I also then will have me and other people prepped to just wander around the families and say, how you doing? Do you need any help with this situation? Because sometimes it's hard for people to manage your 4 kids in a 10-minute quiet zone. And sometimes they just need someone to come along and say, hey, you want to come write a story with God with me? And then they go down and do that. And so sometimes we need to be the body rather than saying, right, parent, you're on your own for this 10-minute thing. Because what I've seen in those scenarios is you have a mother or a father who is just meeting with Jesus, and a 10-year-old who's sitting next to her, staring off into space, who will later tell you that he was chatting to God about something, and a 5-year-old who wants to run around that a teenager picked up and is drawing pictures with God on the floor, and an old person who's just worshiping quietly, rocking a baby. That to me is the goal. The goal is not that the parent has to facilitate the activity. To me, the goal is that we give enough space for next steps, that kids know what is on offer and adults know what's on offer, and the body facilitates those families.
So I'm like, the big overriding feeling behind all of this is that it's
actually
culture change.
I'm going to interrupt you because I have to say you're very good at this. And I came to watch you lead at this, and you're very good at facilitating space of encounter with families and intergenerational in the room. So I would like to turn the question on you, and I would like you to answer that question as well, because I think you're very good at this.
Well, maybe that's where I was going with this, is culture change, isn't it?
Okay.
It's like you say, because it can't all be on me. You're one person. You can't, whether you're the parent, whether you're the worship leader, whether you're the preacher, you're not the Holy Spirit. You can't be with every single person, and we need the body of Christ. And so I think you've got to create culture change in your congregation where, it's a given that in any particular moment in a church service, sometimes you're worshiping, sometimes you're serving, sometimes you're alongside somebody else who's struggling, sometimes you're over here so that this person can be released to worship. Now, we've got to make sure that everybody gets a bit of a turn and that everybody's contributing, and it's not the 10% doing 90% of the work. But we need that culture of saying, well, all of us can do a little bit to facilitate everybody meeting with God.
Yes.
So I really love encouraging, and it's a little bit terrifying. You have to give up control, but like encouraging, pray with the person next to you. You never know who that person is. They might be new to faith. They might have some weird theology. They might be 5 years old, and they might be 80 and they have very limited English. I don't know. And so when I say turn to the person next to you, that could terrify some people. They've never prayed out loud. But also you sometimes generate this gorgeous moment where somebody gets to contribute and pray and be significant and pray their best prayers, and it's really impactful. And so it's all play, everybody gets to do a little bit, and it's not that the person with the sermon or the person at the front is more important or even more godly or even has all the answers or all the wisdom. Their role is to serve by facilitating. So I think that's my cultural framework, and I think I'm, even with the resort's roots are generating the way I want to lead church, is that it really isn't one clever person telling everybody else how to be spiritual or how to understand scripture. It's all of us doing it together. It's all of us sharing our stories. It's all of us opening scripture together, from the youngest to the oldest, from every culture and background. And they all see a slightly different bit of God. Not that God is different, but that God is so big that we all get to see a different bit. And I learn more when I see that person's bit of God. And I go, oh, I'm actually not getting all the full picture. And that sort of bit of humility is very helpful, because I think our world creates an echo chamber, doesn't it? Of like, my views get recycled to me on social media. I read books, I watch television programs that I probably already agree with. So it's only in church where we choose to be in intergenerational, intercultural settings where we are confronted with scripture, with God, with other people who don't think like us, and we're meant to love them. And it's hard. If anybody says it's not hard, I think they haven't really been to church. They're probably, I don't know, consuming something that's very palatable. So, I mean, my big question is, in all of this, is how do you create a culture where it's uncomfortable and still people want to come to it? Because I think it's not easy. Like, you come to church and it's work. Like, you having to give, you're having to be slightly uncomfortable. You're not always getting your preferences. There's beauty and moments of awe and significance and contribution, and they're really amazing, and I think we have to celebrate those and hold those as some of the values and those encounters. But there's a lot of stuff where I'm like, I'm just not getting what I want out of this. This is not my favorite way of doing this. I don't like this song. I don't like how they talk about that. We just have preference, don't we? And we can go, yeah, it's not my favorite this week, but the next thing will be okay. So it's not about me. I think I have to, maybe that's a maturity thing, but I'm trying to teach that to my children as well, of like, church isn't always about you. It's not always about you getting exactly what you need. It's sometimes about what you give so that somebody else gets what they need. I don't know if that answers the question.
It's the why of church. I think for me, that was one thing that I've been reflecting on for a long time, but I think we really saw it coming out of the pandemic was we have to make the case why church is important. And if it is just so that because I'm desperate to get something from God, to get what I want out of it, on one hand, I feel like my discipleship of people then is not deep enough, because if you aren't able to meet with Jesus and get what you want midweek, and it's all reliant on that 1 hour, then actually that's not really about making that hour better. That's about me discipling people to know how to access God in the ordinary every day better. But the other thing is when I remember talking to this guy, I was teaching in Denmark, and this guy raised his hands. We were talking about how you frame things for your kids. And he raised his hand and he said, I find church very boring. And he was sitting next to a senior leader. And I remember thinking like, oh, I don't know where this is going. And he and this teenage boys were all nodding next to me. And he said, I find it boring. Every time I find the sermon boring, and I just find all of church boring, hard to sit through. And I'm thinking, I have no idea what this guy's talking about. And he said, but I always tell my boys, church isn't about being entertained. And then he went into this whole thing of churches to sacrificially love other people and let yourself be loved. He said, it's really important that you talk to people and let them love you. And he said it was about encouraging other people and having other people push courage into your heart, which I loved how he said it, because he's Danish. And push courage into your heart. And it's about letting God's words transform you so you're different at the end of it. And it's about being part of the body. Your job is to be part of the body and give your strength as part of the body. It's not really about whether or not you are entertained. And so I come to church even though it's boring, because it's about more than whether or not it's boring. It's about the importance of church. And all of his boys were nodding. And I just thought, I'm not sure we've pitched that enough to our people, that, yeah, you may find a sermon boring, but it's about you being loved and loving others and encouraging and being transformed and being needed. And whether or not you liked the way that we had to talk to a person next to you is really small, because that moment of talking to the person next to you may be the only positive conversation that person has had all week. I think increasing the sense of purpose that we have in church is an important part of the intergenerational culture thing. Because if you're here for more than yourself, then you're here to help a 10-year-old who's doesn't have a father in his life be surrounded by a bunch of men who sees them. And it's about helping a 75-year-old who hasn't been hugged in a month have people pat her arm and make her feel seen and loved. There's a purpose to it that goes beyond what we get out of a service. But if we're not talking about that, then people are deciding whether or not I enjoy this, as opposed to whether or not this is significant and important part of church.
Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, we measure church by, is the worship excellent? Is the sermon thought-provoking? Are there a lot of people here because if there's a lot of people here, it must be good. Or are my children happy to go to their group? Which, it does say something. But I think, are those measurables really helpful? They're kind of measuring on performance or on, I'm not saying we shouldn't do things excellently. I think God does love excellence. He does love singing in tune. It helps other people to sing. He does love clear communication and clear preaching. And he does love us learning more about him. All of those things, yes. But as we learned through the pandemic, you can listen to your worship music on your headphones. You can listen to a podcast or a talk through the global media that you can get it from around the world. And you can get the very best Bible teachers and communicators. And a lot of people have just done that. And they're not gone back to church because they're getting their needs met. But they're not giving and they're not part of a community. And so if what we do on a Sunday doesn't create those opportunities for that interaction, that body, that awkwardness of like, oh, I don't know this person very well. Can I say this? Okay, I've said it. Maybe that worked. Maybe it didn't. I don't know. But actually now, the next time I see them, they smile awkwardly at me and then we can have another conversation. And that never happens on a screen. It happens by us persevering and choosing to love. And as you say, it not being about us getting our needs met all the time.
Absolutely. And I would argue that just existing on your own, listening to podcasts and worship isn't getting all your needs met, because we were never designed to do our faith on our own. We were designed to be part of the body. There's something that church offers that you can't get anywhere else in terms of that diverse body of people who hold each other and love each other. It's really important. And I think also being in a church, I agree with you that doing things well is important. But I also remember growing up in a small church of 80 people. And I remember, when you have 80 people, you can always have excellence. You have, you have what you have. Who you have. And I remember listening to someone sing, and I remember I rolled my eyes. I was a teenager and I rolled my eyes. I was like, oh my goodness, it's her again. And my mom said, this is a you problem, not a her problem. And she said, look at her. She said, you could either sit and judge her singing, or you could see a person who genuinely loves God, who has lost a child to cancer, who still gets up and worships, and you can see her heart singing. And you can choose to be ministered to by that and choose to draw it into worship, or you can choose to sit here and judge her. You have a choice of how this engages. If you can't meet with Jesus when someone is singing slightly off tune, then you're probably not trying to meet with Jesus. And it was so harsh. And I was
but necessary, it sounds like.
It was so necessary. Totally transformed it. She was so annoyed with me. I thought, that was such an eye-opener for me, that actually someone was genuinely ministering out of her heart to worship Jesus, to draw me into worship, and I was choosing to judge. And I end up having a lot of those conversations sometimes with kids and families and midweek groups, because it's training our eyes to what we're seeing. Are we seeing that I have to talk to somebody, or are we seeing each other who need Jesus and who need my stories? What are we training our eyes to in intergenerational settings?
And I think one of the challenges is when you're a leader, part of like you trying to refine your own craft is that you can get a bit judgy watching other people lead.
Yes.
So my husband and I will often talk about, like, when you go into another church, try not to be in like assessment mode. Like, oh, they do that differently. That sermon was really clear. Look at that notice sheet. Oh, I wouldn't have done it like that. And can be analyzing all the time. And you can do it in your own church. Like somebody else is leading and you're like, oh, I wouldn't have done it like that.
Yes.
Well, I think they've missed that whole demographic. Yes. But what we're not seeing is that person brings something totally different that I don't bring. Now, yes, there's probably mentoring. Yes, we can all grow in our skill set, but it takes all sorts. And sometimes it's about the person doing it not excellently at the front that says to somebody else, well, they're not nailing it. I could have a go.
Yes.
It says, oh, there's permission to not be super perfect at the front. I've always fancied that. Maybe I could get involved in leading. And so, no, they're not doing it perfectly. They're not got great exegesis or whatever it is, their sermon rambled and maybe there was some heresy in there or whatever, but actually there was something about having a go that is equipping. And so there's a challenge of like, we want to do things well, we want to get things right, we want to teach people and equip people, but we also want to give people the chance to try things, to make mistakes, to flounder a bit, because that's how we learn. And the only reason Rachel and I know anything about any of this is because we've done it wrong a million times.
Terribly.
And we're like, don't do it like that.
Yes.
My sing-song voice was in proud form as a teenager, because that's how people did it. And I thought I had to be like a telly presenter, so it's only when you reflect or people reflect back to you that you go, oh yeah, that really didn't work. And so we've got to create a culture that allows people to mess up or not be quite as good as us.
Yes.
And yeah, I think that's hard because we also kind of get to a point where like, oh, it flows really nicely when I do it. Or
yes,
we're hitting our targets because I've set the target.
Yes.
I know how to hit them. But like allowing children, allowing people who are older, allowing people who have English as a second language to get up and facilitate and participate,
Yes.
it's going to go differently than how we expect. But that's okay. And it's
because
important.
of the fruit. Because because I think that's the thing is if our goal is I want to perform this correctly and perfectly, then we're always going to be focused on all the ways it went not perfectly. But if I'm saying my goal in this room is for people to genuinely develop love for each other, to genuinely help display the heart of God to each other well, and I'm going to try to make people feel safe as I do that, I'm going to make space for people to get up and tell a testimony that goes on for way too long and gets way too inappropriate at moments. And you think, oh, we have to unwind this. It creates space for that because you may go, it's not how I would have designed it, but people grew closer together in their love for each other and people began to feel like a greater part. It's if you know the fruit that you want to see, you're willing to handle imperfection to get there. If you're just looking at, did I perform the service well and did it go smoothly, we're going to miss the values that are actually growing really well.
And sometimes when it goes wrong, it becomes a talking point, which is actually really good. So people remember when the mic didn't work or when the video didn't work and whether you lost your temper with the AV person. People remember.
Yes.
People remember it being awkward and then they have a conversation about it later, or it creates conversations at home. When it's slick and perfect, it kind of goes in and out, doesn't it? So the imperfection allows us to sort of wrestle with it a bit more. And maybe it means people go and look the Bible passage up and go, oh, it didn't quite sit right. It makes other conversations. I'm not at all saying try to be heretical or imperfect, but I think it's let's make space for trying and experimenting and different voices.
Yeah. Absolutely. While
still developing our skills of communication.
Absolutely, yes. Important is to develop the skills. This is not where we thought this was going to go.
I love this conversation, Rachel. It's been really good. Well, thank you for the gems that you've given us and for who you are. And really appreciated chatting.
Oh, well, I love talking with you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Season 2 of the Roots for Churches podcast is a collaboration with Intergenerate UK Network. Head to intergenerateuk.org for resources, webinars, and ways to connect with others on the Intergen journey across the UK. If you'd like to hear more from Rachel, I encourage you to check out her article in Roots Worship Together, issue 138. Or watch the recording of the Intergenerate UK webinar on intergenerational preaching, where she was one of our guests. You can find it on the Roots for Churches YouTube channel, or there are links from the Intergenerate UK website. Roots for Churches has been publishing resources for intergenerational ministry for over 23 years, with a weekly intergenerational outline for every week of the year. Roots produce weekly and seasonal content to help you lead great church. GREAT is an acronym for growing, relevant, engaging, authentic, and together. Our weekly intergenerational resources aim to equip you to lead a growing church that leads people into encounter with Jesus. Relevant and fresh ideas from our culture and times. Engaging all the senses and getting everyone participating. Building authentic relationship with each other and exploring scripture together. Head to rootsforchurches.com and take out a free 4-week trial. As well as weekly and seasonal resources, you'll find podcasts, videos, and articles about different elements of intergenerational ministry. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with a friend and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the series. Together, we can grow.